Welcome, everybody, to our talk with author Derek Black about his book, Schoolhouse Burning. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are in our nation. I'm Beth Wittenberry. I'm chair of the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice of the American Bar Association. And I chose this book for our seminal project here called One Section, One Book. This is the first book that we'll be reading jointly, all of us together as a section. And I wanted to just start off and explain why I chose this project. And I chose it because the theme for my year as chair is unity through civic literacy. Unity because I thought our nation really needed to focus on that. And civic literacy because I feel strongly that if our nation understands better civics and how our democracy functions and what it is set up to do and how it's supposed to run, that we will have much less divisiveness if we all really understand that an understanding of civics in and of itself will help to bring unity. And so that's why I picked that theme. Why I chose this book was I set out to find a book, as I was just explaining to Derek, that I thought fit that theme, that met those two criteria. And honestly, I couldn't find one. Derek's book came out last fall and I had started looking before that. And so I was so grateful when I did finally come across it and realize that this is the book. This is the book that explains to us why civic literacy is important, public education, the right to public education in America, how that's evolved, the ins and outs of that. And so I was really excited to find it. And I learned so much by reading it. As you all probably know, the title of the book is Schoolhouse Burning, but it has a subtitle, which is Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. And so you can tell, I know I'm mirror image here, but that was the perfect title for what I was looking for. So it's a law-related book, but the nice thing I found about it, Derek, was that it's a fairly easy read, right? It's not so academic that you have to be a lawyer to get something out of it, which I enjoyed. So it was an easy read. It's not too terribly long. It hits all the points that I wanted to know. And I learned a lot, as I said, by reading it. I've used it as a resource already. I've had journalists call me and ask me about the public right to a public education. And I've actually looked it up in your book and referred them to your book. You'll be happy to know that. So many people think that there is a federal right to a public education. And this book explains the history of any existing rights to public education and how our nation has thought about that topic from our founding fathers right up to the present day, and explains that although there isn't actually a federal right, and I won't spoil the book, it does give you the intricacies of how that law has developed through time. So I invite all of you to visit our initiative page of our section website to see the instructions for participating in our One Section, One Book project. We have suggested timelines there for you on reading the chapters, and we've scheduled a fun time to meet virtually for a discussion in December in conjunction with our end of the year party. So I hope that you will calendar now, Wednesday, December 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for that fun event, and register for our initiatives, Schoolhouse on our Schoolhouse Burning initiatives page. And I'm hopeful that in addition to a discussion and some other fun end of the year activities, we might have a short trivia contest based on facts that you would find in Derek's book. So that's an incentive for you to read it and be prepared to just excel in that brief trivia contest we'll have at that meeting. So with that, I would like to turn to our discussion today with our author, Derek, and thank you again, Derek, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So we've invited him to talk to us about his book. And so I'm just going to start out with a question. You know, Derek, what prompted you to write this book? I know that you're a professor and you have, you know, an academic legacy there with your subject matters, but what prompted you to write this particular book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the teachers at the end of the day were my initial motivation. We had in Arizona, we had 50,000 teachers, protesting on the state capitol. Here in South Carolina, well, actually, no, I'm in Texas right now. As a small digression, I got to meet Demetrio Rodriguez, who was the plaintiff in Rodriguez, San Antonio versus Rodriguez. Got to meet his daughter today. I was on a panel with her, and that was a special moment. But and thinking about sort of these social movements, and certainly Demetrio had his own movement then. We saw new movements happening in 2018, 2019 with teachers protesting across the nation. And in South Carolina, we had the largest protest on the steps of the State House in history, right? It was a protest around public education. So there's all this energy that was happening across the nation. And during that time, what we saw was this rhetoric around that right to education was sort of part of the claim to something from government that was being made. But I was really just kind of in awe in many respects, and wanted to tell those folks' story. Now, I was told, Derek, you're not a journalist, so you can't tell the story of protests. And so I didn't. But I think that at least sort of got me moving in that direction. And the other part is just, the recognition that public education has played in my life. The first draft, or the final draft of this book, didn't say anything about me in it. And I'd finished the book up, and I asked someone for comments, and he claimed that I had left out part of the story, and I didn't understand. And he said, well, your sort of personal story coming to this project is important too. And I said, no, that's self-indulgent. That's what self-indulgent people do. I'm a professor. I get to indulge all the time. I don't need to do that in a book form. But he convinced me that my story was connected to it. And as I really began to reflect in that introduction, in the preface, and understand sort of who I am and my relationship to public education, my relationship to the law and the work that I do, I was like, it is part of the story. You cannot separate my perspective on these from my personal experience. And the shortest version of that is, I grew up in a very white community, rural community, but that little community also was the first place that Thurgood Marshall went after Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, that was long before I was born, but my high school was the first high school, traditionally white high school in the South, to graduate an African American. And so I think being part of that place and being part of that community gave me a sense of history that I didn't fully understand. But the other thing but it was sort of motivating, right, to try to figure out these questions. But the other thing that I say in the book is that, I didn't have a lot of advantages going for me as a young person. And ultimately, public education is that intergenerational gift that I received. And I received it because people had made decisions some 150 years before I was born that made this made this a central institution. And so I think my life has been a story of trying to make sure that I pass on that intergenerational gift to others. So that certainly biases me in the way that I see this story and biases me in my motivations. But that's it. That's why I wrote this book, in awe of teachers and also an appreciation of what this public institution has meant to my life and what I want it to mean for other children's lives.
Thanks, Derek. It's always nice to hear what motivates an author, right? To put that story out there and to hear how it's really important to you as a person to put this out and your past and your perspectives. So what can we hope to learn by reading your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the book is, you might say it's got two stories in it. It's got this one story that's really about the teachers of 2018 and 2019. And it explains how they landed there. Why is it that you have the largest public protests in state capitals happening across the country? And they're not happening, in Los Angeles. They're not happening in Boston. They're not happening in sort of, liberal places. They're happening in the reddest of red places, right? This whole movement starts in West Virginia, voted for Donald Trump 70%. It moves from West Virginia to Kentucky and to Oklahoma and to Arizona, right? These are not, and to Texas as well, not the places that we think about necessarily when we're thinking about civil rights protests or public education protests. So there's a story about them and why and how how things had gotten bad enough to push them to the point that they organized and brought these together. And so there's this modern policy discussion that's going on. But what I say in the book, and I say in a lot of these talks, is that there really was this sort of perfect storm happening where you had school funding, which had been hammered on for a decade. You had public school teachers who were being attacked in terms of tenure, promotion, these sorts of things where states are taking away tenure, they're imposing teacher evaluation systems. You have teacher salaries falling flat. And you also have this movement of funds out of the traditional public school system into charter school programs and into voucher programs. And there's all sorts of policy analysis that's flying about, and all sorts of arguments and rhetoric, which I've participated in that myself. But I said you can't fully interpret this storm, this three-headed storm, while you're in the middle of it. And we literally were still are in the middle of it. And I said, we've got to have some perspective on this. And so I back way up and go, let's go much, much earlier to the beginning so that we can ask a different question. Instead of asking, do charters produce, good academic outcomes? Are vouchers going to produce better educational outcomes? Let's ask a question that says, why do we have public education? What is the role that it's played in our democracy across time? And are charters and vouchers a continuation of that story, or are they a reversal or a digression or a right turn from that story? And I think that at least gives us more perspective, right? And so I think that's one thing you learn, right? Where does the current moment fit in that overall historical arc? But I think the sort of thesis within that is you sort of you learn how democracy and education have walked hand in hand since the beginning, or how voting, more specifically voting and education, have walked hand in hand. And that as we have expanded access to the ballot, we've understood the need to expand access to education. Clearly, the only folks voting early on were white men with land, right? And so we didn't need to educate as many folks, or well, we needed to, but we were not educating as many folks. But as that sort of population that's controlling government grows larger, public education is supposed to be the defense against that government being mismanaged or the voter being manipulated or not being able to participate. And so you see these things walking hand in hand at the foundation. We see them also walking hand in hand during Reconstruction following the Civil War. Unfortunately, we also see them walking hand in hand when we shrink democracy. So during Jim Crow, when the South in particular, but various other parts of the nation as well, are not happy with African Americans being increasingly fuller citizens. They weren't full at any point then, but fuller citizens in our democracy. You see laws trying to constrict not just the ballot box, but access to education itself, right? And so they understand the leaders understood that if we want to reduce, or if they want to reduce African Americans to second-class citizens, they need a two-pronged strategy. And we look at what the civil rights movement does, right? In the 30s, 40s, and then ultimately in Brown, they don't start with voting. They don't start with the workplace, right? They don't start with buses. They start with public education, right? And it becomes the foundation on which we grow these other concepts of citizenship, and we demand more at the ballot box. And so that history, then I use that to say, well, what's going on today with voting and education? And is this a step backwards? I'm not going to compare it to Jim Crow. It's not the same. But is this retrenchment, or is this a fuller blossoming of democracy? And that's the question I'm trying to answer in the book.
And that's fascinating, Derek. And it reminds me of an initiative that we did several years ago that you may not be aware of, but over a 10-year period, we had focus groups around the nation look at if there was a federal right to public education, a quality education, what would that entail? How do you define that right? What are the aspects of a quality education that Americans feel strongly about? And we published those findings in a book called the Education Bill of Rights, which you might like to see. It was fascinating because we purposely did these focus groups around the nation, and our charge to them was to try to make each group as diverse as possible, to get as many different viewpoints on that as we could. And we did, in fact, find, that there were several things where almost everybody agreed, right, were super important. But when you sort of overlay that over what you were talking about now with the efforts of charter schools and voucher programs and all of that, right? It becomes an even broader and more fascinating discussion, I think. And perhaps the reason I enjoyed your book so much was because I did head up that study that we were doing back then. It just kind of brought it all full circle for me and laid it out in legal terms just so clearly. So could you give us an overview then of what we would read in your book?
Yeah, I mean, so early on, a little bit of what I've just talked about, but it sort of starts out with this idea of how we conceptualize education, right? So where does it fit in our democracy? And I said, look, this is ultimately a gift that I'd call it, a gift that our forefathers or founders had given, at least to some of us, right? Obviously, all of us didn't get it. They're giving us voting and education, right? And as I say, are we protecting, or are we not protecting, or how have we protected this across time? And again, I start in the modern day because when I'm really, not that I'm giving anything away with the title of the book, but the central thesis is that the assault on public education, which I demonstrate is occurring factually, that the assault on public education cannot be understood simply as an attack on public schools. It is an attack on our system of democracy itself. Now, some folks might think that is too far of a statement. And that's what the book is defending, right? Is to say, look, let me prove it to you, or let's give you my perspective on why I believe that's true. And because what we have is a lot of rhetoric around education. I mean, people have said, and people continually say, education is the bedrock of democracy and it improves. Like if you Google books and education democracy, Beth, you said you had some troubles earlier, but if you do, they'll come with a lot of books. But when you open them, what you'll find is that some of them are purely rhetorical. You'll find that some of them are situated solely in the modern context, and they're really just saying, I think we can make a better democracy if we do all this stuff, right? And so, but none of them are really answering, or none of them actually have answered. What role has it played in building our democracy and fighting for our democracy? So again, it might seem like hyperbole to say that the attack on public education is an assault on democracy, since a lot of the current conversation is, lacking in that historical depth. But I go through time to say, it has to, that if you understand what public education has been as part of our constitutional democracy for the better part of 200 years, then you understand we are really putting that constitutional democracy at risk. And I'll go one step further, and this isn't in the book, but I was scheduled to give remarks to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, which operates, I guess, in the basement. Well, it used to be in the basement of the U.S. Capitol, but I think they're in a separate facility now. But they handle all of the sort of the historical stuff at the Capitol. And so I was scheduled to give a lecture to them on January the 7th of this year about my book. because they want to talk about education as a civil right. And of course, I was very excited about this opportunity. And then, of course, on January the 6th, we had the insurrection, the assault on the Capitol. And I thought, well, that, well, actually, I wasn't thinking about the book talk at all, but I was like, I assume they'll call me to cancel this thing at some point. And I don't know if it was the morning of January the 7th or the evening of January the 6th, but they said, Derek, we still want to do it, but we want you to talk about the insurrection. What are your thoughts on it? And where does this fit in the American story of democracy? And I said yes. And the unfortunate thing is I didn't have to change my remarks that much to give that lecture, because the book and its themes transition to this question about how do we find common values? How do we come to appreciate our liberties? How do we understand our liberties? How do we understand the rule of law? And look, public education has never done everything it needs to do on that. But what I said to them over the course of that talk is that if we are going to begin to heal our wounds, our democracy's wounds, if we are going to begin to help people understand how reprehensible, right, the assault on the Capitol was. And I don't just mean reprehensible because, you voted for one person, you don't like the other. I mean reprehensible as an assault on all of us, regardless of who you voted for. Right? That is the work of public education. Right? The preparation of citizens, the appreciation for the rule of law. That's why we have public schools. We actually, now, of course, business wants workers, and so they support and they push education policy. I don't want to ignore that. But if you look at the founding constitutional documents in the 50 states, if you look at why Congress has gotten involved, at least for the first 100 years, we talk a little bit more about international competitiveness now. All of that conversation is about appreciating our democracy, protecting our democracy, making it work. And so, I think that is a big theme that's cooked into the book that I think, unfortunately, is very important as we struggle through these things. And so I have, post-insurrection, have turned back to a lot of these themes and said, this isn't just sort of an academic conversation about what we ought to do for schools. This is a conversation about what we have to do if our democracy is going to survive.
I love that. And one of the things that I loved about your book was it's bothered me for a while that there is no constitutional right. It wasn't written into the Constitution. And in your book, you explain why that was, right? And how that came to be. And yet how the founding fathers' value of a public education came to be put forward as our nation developed and as it worked its way across North America. And so I found that very fascinating, and it helped me in a sense, because I've been sort of annoyed that it didn't get written into the Constitution, right? And I don't want to give the book away, everybody. I want you to read it for yourself, how that unfolded. But Derek makes the point in there that even if it's not actually written into the Constitution, it is ingrained into the fiber of our nation and our democracy. And so what you're saying now about fast forwarding to the insurrection, it is all part of that one story, right? And highlights why it is so important that we keep that right to a public education.
Well, yeah, let me say it so that no one thinks that that the book is legalese. I mean, you were reading between the lines, and so you may have read things that weren't in there. I mean, the interesting thing about this book is that it does not make an argument for or against a federal constitutional right to education. But what it does have, now that we've got a bunch of lawyers on here, it has all the facts. You can do with them what you want. And, I kind of thought if I get into this, arguing about, the right to education, I am working on other materials and books around that. Like that could be a different book, but this was a really, I think, a story of America, democracy, and education. That's what it is. And you can do with it what you want, you know. Now, I think there's really only one conclusion that you can draw after you read these facts, and that, of course, that's how we want to write our briefs. But I stayed away from that. So, you know, leave that sort of, is this a federal constitutional right, or what's the implications of that? I'll leave that to my law review articles. But since I do have, you know, a lawyer audience, I can tell you what's not in the book, right? But the story is complicated because what we have is the federal government insisting on public education through various means, demanding it, requiring it through laws, but they're requiring states to be the ones that do it. And so when we talk about federalism and sort of the experiments of the experimentation in the states, that often means states can do whatever they want to, or we're going to let them play it out. I think the story is a lot different here, because what we really have is Congress pushing states to all move in one direction, because it is part of our Republican democratic form of government, but we just want states to be the ones delivering it. And so, again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds. And again, my law review articles can get into that, but it is, I kind of can upset legal scholars on both sides of the fence with this. You know, we've got friends that are very heavy into the state constitutional right to education, and when you start talking about the federal right to education, they get all bent out of shape. That's a waste of time. You know, the courts are never going to recognize that, and you're just going to give states an excuse to stop doing stuff. Okay, I heard you. Then you know, you start talking about state rights, and the people on the federal end will say, you know, those states, they're all doing wrong by their students unless the feds step in and do something. We'll never get it right. There must be a federal right to education. I think the story of my book is that there is, I think what you would conclude, Beth, maybe you can tell me what your conclusion was. There is both a federal and a state right to education, but the substance and nature of those things are interlocked. They're not actually separate things, right? I think that's the simplest way to describe it as a historical matter. I think that's actually what happened.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying. I certainly didn't mean to put words.
Oh, no. I didn't mean that. I was just coy in the book to not put that final sentence in.
No, you were, and that's absolutely right. And I have to say, you know, this is just my personal, very strongly held, you know, desire. And I'm speaking as me, as Beth Wittenberry, the person, not as a chair and not for the ABA. I need to put that disclaimer in there when I say that, right? But I would like to invite people to start putting questions in the chat. We will get to a section here where you can ask your questions to Derek through me. So feel free to do that as Derek and I continue to have this conversation here. So Derek, I wanted to switch the conversation just a little bit now. I know we have members in our audience who either have written or are contemplating writing things. I know that I've done that myself. So I'm curious, you know, this is a book that isn't put out by a university press, right? How did you go about finding a publisher for your book? Did you have to do the traditional query letters? Did you have an agent? You know, this must have mattered to you to go through this particular route to get your words out there. How did that come to be?
Yeah, so I'll kind of answer that in reverse, because there's one part of the story I think is somewhat humorous, or it shows my own inferiorities, but a sense of inferiority. But so, you know, I had opportunity to publish this book with Oxford University Press, Yale University Press, New York University Press, and then Public Affairs, which is a division of Hachette. And I wasn't confident, to be quite honest. I wasn't confident I could deliver on this book, right? I mean, it was something different. I was like, yeah, I may jack this thing up and people aren't going to like it. The academics won't like it, and lay folks just won't. They'll be like, what is this gobbledygook? So I remember asking a couple of different, I called Irvin Chemerinsky and was talking to him, and I talked to Cheryl Cashin at Georgetown, and then I talked to one of my good friends who I could be a little bit more honest with. And I'll be honest with you, I said, well, maybe I should just go with Yale. And he said, why is that? I said, because if it's no good, it'll still say Yale on my CV next to the title of the book. And no one will know the difference. And because they won't read it anyway. And then Cheryl Cashin was wise enough to tell me that if she was going to spend time on a book, she wanted someone to read it. And so she's done a couple of 2 or 3, non-academic press books. And she said, law professors have a privilege that other people don't, which is they can do this. And they can say things and they're not gonna get in trouble, and they're not gonna lose their tenure or anything like that. It's so, you have a privilege, use it. She didn't tell me to, but after she gave me the spiel, that was the conclusion that left out. So I said, okay, so that's why I went to popular press. In terms of how I actually got to that point, yeah, I mean, I did the query letters and the proposal and all that stuff, and I didn't really know how that would go. I've got some friends who've written non-academic books, and it can be soul crushing. It just seems, you just don't know. It's like I'm just sending these random query letters, and we read about the struggling, authors and how hard it is for them to break through. So I probably sent 20 or 25. Now I'm giving you lots of good information, but 20 or 25 query letters. I was kind of sending them out in batches of 5 or 10. I didn't want to send out a ton, but I was sending them out in small little chunks. And I got some responses back out of that, probably 2 or 3 agents. We had some sort of back and forth, and then I found the person, Matthew Carnicelli, that it's been great, and it was like dating. It really was. We were filling each other out, and so I was in New York for something else, I don't know, and we just got together and had coffee, and I decided I liked him and I trusted him, and he decided that I was not cuckoo, and he said yes. But that's only part of the story. So once he said yes, we then rewrote the entire proposal and completely
So
changed.
Derek, just to clarify, this is an agent or agents you were writing the queries to, not directly to the publishers.
That's right. Yeah, I would not bother sending them to I would not bother personally sending them to the book. So this was to the agent, and so we met, we talked, we reworked it. And so what I found during that process is that a couple of things. Number one, they're kind of buying you as an individual, which is a weird way. You just kind of think, well, it's just about the book, and it's not. And the reason why it's not just about the book anymore, it seems to me, is because they're not going to sell their book for you. You got to sell it yourself. And so they're looking for someone that either maybe has a budget, which I do as an academic, that will help me promote the book and travel around and that sort of thing, because they don't want to do it. Someone who's engaged enough in sort of other materials that maybe they can get some traction in the media. So they're kind of, it's kind of like putting the boy bands together. I guess they got girl bands now too, but it's like, whatever, we got the songs, can we find the person to put in there? So there's a little bit of that, which is unfortunate. Yeah, and so they decide, like, this seems like someone that's got the energy to sort of run with the book, which that's not fair, but for those that are thinking about it, I mean, it is like, are you going to hustle for yourself a little bit? And then Matthew, my agent, he was like, look, Derek, this book you've got and you've put together, it's not big enough. That was his argument. So, you have to write a big book. That's what he called it, a big book. Because number one, people do not want to read education policy. They don't want to read statistics. They don't want to read law. So you've got to find your themes and your narratives. And it's kind of funny because as a law professor, he would start talking about history. You need to talk a lot more about Brown versus Board of Education, the history there. And in my original proposal, I had very little there. I said, everyone already knows that. Why would I say that again? It's just like repeating yourself. He's like, everyone doesn't know it. You think they know it, they don't know it. So tell the story. So there was a learning curve for me. And fortunately, I found a good agent who would work with me. And so that is trying to be helpful to your audience. I think that's the thing when you're working with agent is like, there's some agents that they don't want to work with you, and it's either ready to go when you send it to them, or they're not going to take it at all. And so those are the people telling me no. Or there's some that says, you know what, I see something here, but I need to develop this person. So I owe my agent a tremendous amount of credit for helping me develop the book into what it became.
That's a great story. I mean, I love to just hear that backstory, right? The behind the scenes look at how these things come to be. So, so thank you so much for sharing that with us. We do have several questions that came to us through the chat. So rather than monopolize it with the rest of my questions, let's go to these. And we have a question here, Derek, about whether you can speak about the role of teachers' unions and their role, past and future, in supporting public education.
Yeah, so I'll answer that one, and I'll preface Janelle George's question, or give it, make sure it's next as Janelle asks a question.
You too.
So, but as the teachers unions, so, you know, the teachers unions have generally been a key part of the development of, at least the modern development of the state constitutional right to education, because, you know, they are the most organized unit that can hold the state accountable for its delivery of that, right? And so they've certainly have supported that litigation, you know, in places like New Jersey, which is at the most of anyone, and lots of other states. So they are a key supporter, a key part of it. They also are the villain, right? I mean, I talk about that in the book, that teachers become a national villain, right? The cover of Time magazine said the war on teachers, right? And so people may remember Vergara versus State, you know, sort of even in the courts, they're being attacked as somehow their tenure rights are interfering. Literally, the argument in Vergara is that teachers' tenure rights violate students' constitutional right to education in the state of California. So I think, you know, the teachers become the villains. They get picked on a lot, which then creates their, that's part of the reason why they get more engaged in 2018 and 2019. But they also engage more than just themselves, right? I mean, that's the thing that you see, is that you see families and students rallying around the teachers. They're not the villains that some would make, you know, some governors would make them out to be. And then maybe we can jump to Janelle. I love talking about the question that Janelle asked there.
Yeah, that was going to be my next one. I think it's a two-parter, but we'll go with the first part. Can you talk about the era of Reconstruction that you cover in your book, and the role of Black politicians in creating the contemporary public education system, and what education was like pre-Civil War? Yeah,
and so I've got, for those that are, I know Janelle's interested, for those that are interested even more, I just posted a paper on SSRNs coming out in Northwestern University Law Review. It's called Freedom, Democracy, and the Right to Education. And it goes even a little bit further on this question of Reconstruction and what was going on there. But let me fill everyone else in a bit. So the short speed version of this is that, of course, during slavery, African Americans were prohibited from reading and writing. Well, actually, let's distinguish. In some places, they were only prohibited from writing. Some places they were prohibited from reading and writing. But there also are prohibitions on teaching enslaved persons to read and write. There are also prohibitions on whites having controversial materials that were inconsistent with slavery as an empire. And so we have this attack on literacy in the South that is happening. And you'll find people know that as a general principle. But what they don't know, I don't think they know as well, is how that denial of education shapes the meaning of education in the African American community. That education is a path to mental liberty. It is a path to physical liberty in the North. So it really is sort of quite important. And so there were periods in the South in which there had been a more liberal approach to education, that there were slaves, enslaved persons, and African Americans that were reading and writing in the early 1800s. But as the tensions over slavery grow, the South cracks down even more on Black literacy. And so what happens is that the Black elders, pass down what education they had in secret. So there's this secret learning that happens for decades, but it's not like everyone, can read and write. But it's this sort of prized possession that gave one standing, maybe sort of, again, mental freedom and maybe physical freedom. So there's this pent up energy to get this forbidden fruit. And before the Civil War is even over, right? As soon as African Americans make their way to the Union line and achieve physical liberty, the very next thing that they want is to learn to read and write. And so we have these schools that are being constructed and built and flooded with learners during the middle of the Civil War, right? And so this sort of movement for public education is really just on, you see the sort of desire for it. And so when the Civil War closes, Congress understands. We also have enormous rates of white illiteracy in the South as well. Congress understands that if we're going to rebuild democracy, coming back to my main theme, right, and elevate African Americans to real citizenship, that public education has to be part of making the South an actual democracy, or what the Constitution would call a Republican form of government. And so that's what happens, right, during those magic moments. Now, Janelle also asked about the role of Black politicians. They are at the forefront, right? They are, the Constitutional Convention of 1868 in South Carolina is majority African American, right? The legislature, state legislature, is majority African American. So people like Robert Smalls, for those that might recognize his name, famous, I think he actually was the last Black Southern representative in the United States House of Representatives. I think he held on the longest. He held his seat all the way up well into Jim Crow. But in any event, thanks, Janelle. So in any event, these Black legislators are the ones that really began making the statutory structure to build this system. So I've said in some talks that, public education, at least in the South, it's a Black idea, because they didn't have public education for whites or Blacks prior to the Civil War in any systematic way. And so, yeah, it is quite a story to tell. And in fact, the book I'm working on right now, that's going a little bit slower and landing a deal, I'm writing an entire book that's really just about this story that I'm talking about right now, which is, why did the South criminalize literacy? How did that create the sort of underground movement for education? And then how did Black leaders build a public education system? And what does that tell us about literacy today and what we need to do? So anyway, I'm working through that book right now, because it's just, it's a story that boggles my mind when the deeper I go into it.
And it was part of the book that I actually loved the most. So, I got so much out of that section of your book. So thanks, Janelle, for highlighting that with your question. I appreciate it. We'll go to part 2 here of her question, which was also, can you talk about school funding and how state school funding systems have contributed to racial inequality in education?
Yeah, that's the kind of the talk I was giving today here at the Education Law Association with Demetrio Rodriguez's daughter. So, there's some funny things that happen. I'll just try to give you the shortest version of that. And I was talking about Rodriguez. Rodriguez normalizes the idea of local school funding. And what I mean is, we had it for some while, but that it is actually an inherent and necessary function of public schooling. And it has been here, right, since the beginning. You would think, if you read Rodriguez, and then of course we moved to Milliken versus Bradley, which is the case that prohibited inter-district school desegregation. And Milliken versus Bradley says we can't desegregate schools in Detroit and cross district lines because that would mess up school financing, and local school financing and local control of education is the most important and vital tradition in education, right? And so there's this lore that gets built around the school district and its role in financing. And once Rodriguez does that, and once Milliken does that, you see these state courts repeating it in their own litigation, which I find quite curious. They don't tell their own state histories. They say, as Rodriguez said, as Milliken said. So they're just kind of repeating what the Supreme Court says. But if we dig parts of this, is in Schoolhouse Burning, that talks about how those initial public school systems in the South really were state financed, and they became locally financed to allow Jim Crow to do its work, because they, even during that period, were afraid that if they ran discrimination out of the state house with explicit, black line item vetoes, black taxes and white taxes, that actually might be unconstitutional. There was a Kentucky case that struck down a similar situation in Kentucky. So the local school district and local financing, at least in much of the South, becomes a way to achieve separate but equal education. Now, that doesn't explain local school financing in every state in the country, and I don't want to digress too far on that. But part of the talk I was giving today is that story of local school financing is different in every state. There's nothing normative about it. It is an accident of history sometimes. And sometimes it sort of swung back and forth at different periods in time. Well, we'll do it local, we'll do state, but no one likes taxes, so let's change it up. So there's a lot more to it. But when you just read Rodriguez, you think that it is an inherent and necessary part of public education. So a law review article, not a book, that I'm working on right now, is kind of trying to denormalize that concept, sort of denormalize the notion that local school funding is inherent and necessary part of public education that has just always been with us. It's certainly been there for a long time, but the story is more complicated than Rodriguez would have you believe.
Okay, well, it's clear from your answers to these questions that you are a very prolific writer, because if it's not a proposal for another book, it's a law review article. So it's fun. We could actually read, all of your writings, and I'm sure become experts on all of this ourselves. All right, we have two more questions here for you, Derek. The first is, what do you believe are the greatest threats currently facing the public school systems in America today, both given the current political climate plagued with unprecedented levels of polarization, as well as in terms of a historical context throughout our nation's history?
Yeah, well, it's not the same answer that I would have given 2 years ago. I'll say that. One of the themes of the book is the overwhelming consensus in favor of public education across time. It's been manipulated, it's been racialized, but it has been bipartisan. It has been part of what we do as a society. And we have lots of racial inequity. We have lots of other types of inequity and socioeconomic inequity. We have lots of inadequacy in our schools. And those are the things that most of the time folks like myself will talk about as being the biggest threats. But I believe that right now, the biggest threat is to the concept of public education itself as being something that we do. And so the book is sort of saying, hey, it's under attack. But what we've seen in this pandemic is that has been ratcheted up. Right? You asked about teachers earlier. Right? So public school teachers are the reason why your children weren't in school last year, right? They don't want to be there, right? There's that narrative. Public school governance is the reason why you're not getting a good education. Or I should say that education freedom is what we need. We don't need public education, we need education freedom. that it is the public education system that is boxing us in and constraining us. And so there's all these sort of subtle and not subtle rhetorical moves that are undermining our faith in public education as a concept, right? Critical race theory. Public educators are trying to indoctrinate your children and turn them into communists, right? So there's all of these attempts to undermine the fabric and commitment to public education itself. And that is the number one threat at the moment. And again, that's not to minimize segregation and funding inequality, but is to say that if the concept and commitment to a common system of schools fails, there will be no school segregation policy to think about. There will be no school funding equalization policy to think about. We will have children in lots of different silos, in private schools, charters, and other forms, in which we lose the common good. And on top of that, even if our most disadvantaged children stay in the schools, right? And because they are committed to this common idea, if we lose that larger diverse community, the other part of the diverse community being wealthier, middle-class whites who have historically been committed to this system, at least for their own children. If they're no longer on board with public education, then how do we pass legislation that would ever fully fund education if a good chunk of our power brokers have given up on the system? So I really do worry about that. And of course, a lot of them left last year and went to private school on their own dime, to be quite clear. Long-term supporters of public education. A lot of them have come back this year, but I think we really do have an identity crisis right now. With all that said, I think we're going to make it through. I've looked at public polling data on this. We have lost 5 to 10% of that public commitment. But the great thing about public education, at least in the way I describe it, is, it starts at a baseline of 80%. And so, I like 80 better than 72, but there still is an overwhelming commitment to the concept, but we can't just keep losing a few percentage points at a time. We're going to find ourselves in a scary place.
Yes, very, very important point to make. I'm glad you made it, Derek. Thank you. All right, so we actually have 2 more questions now because we got an additional one. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to give you that so you can judge your answers accordingly. So your book shows clearly the link between democracy and public education. This person is concerned with the absence of civics education in the last 20 years, although states are starting to reintroduce civics, and political manipulation with the content of that civics education. Have you done any analysis of that issue?
Yeah, I have. In fact, ironically enough, one of the final things that the Obama administration, I'll be quick. One of the final things the Obama administration did on the way out was they had this bipartisan commission on service. And it was really because the military was struggling to get people to sign up for service. As this commission went further and further down the road, they said, we're struggling with all forms of public service commitment, one of them being getting teachers, right? A teacher shortage. So they brought me in as one of the experts to give testimony on what is the appropriate role of Congress in terms of promoting civics education, where are we now, et cetera, et cetera. So I said a lot of things about that, but you can probably guess what they were, but there's an enormous deficit as the question asked. We really do have to focus on it. Strangely enough, Chris Coons and John Cornyn, I think the whip for the Republicans, they actually sponsored a bipartisan bill to make a bigger investment in civics education. I like that bill, except for its accountability measures, I think are problematic. But I think we've had Congress with its No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about English, math, and science. And social studies has just gotten crowded out, and of course civics as well. Same thing at the state level. A lot of people are talking about this. Rick Kahlenberg at the Century Foundation has done some reports on this. A lot of people talking about it. So I think people have woken up to this problem. I think it's just we went so far down the path of other standards that that we've got to rewind, and to be, or make space. And to be clear, a standardized civics curriculum is not what we need. What we need is a civics education that is more critical and engaging. So the idea that we're going to, this will teach kids and then we'll have them do A, B, C, D, like that, that's a terrible idea. So anyway, there certainly is movement on it. And again, I think this is part of how do we think about instilling values that make us more willing to engage in civic conversation at school boards and on the steps of the U.S. House of Representatives as well. So we definitely have work to do there.
All right, thank you for that. Last question, and hopefully it's a relatively quick answer here. Is Serrano versus Priest still good law in California? And has it had an ameliorative impact on inequality in education in California? Is that something you can answer?
Yeah, so it's still good law, but it doesn't really have an impact anymore. And I'll tell you why. You know, Serrano was an equity case. And so what California purportedly did, and there's some empirical disagreements about this, was instead of leveling everyone up, they kind of did a leveling down problem, right? And so there's, you know, lots of people displeased with the public schools in California. That's not Serrano's fault. It was, you know, a legislative decision to go down rather than up. There's also tax issues that have created a problem. So what you have seen in the clinic at Stanford has brought some adequacy type litigation. There was the Williams case brought about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago by the ACLU of Northern California. It also was an adequacy case that's trying to move the floor up instead of, you know, making everyone equal and that moving us down. Let's just move the floor up and forget about inequality as much. Governor Schwarzenegger was the one that signed the bill to settle the Williams case, which injected some money, but not enough. So I would say Serrano's still good law, but it hasn't produced what folks wanted to. It was one of the first school finance cases. I think we had not figured it all out yet. We still haven't figured it all out. And I think what California needs is a bumping up of adequacy as much as anything right now.
Well, living in California, you know, it's, and I know the person who asked the question is also in California. You know, we're always struggling to get enough funding for schools, and more. We definitely need more funding for schools. So I hear what you're saying there. Well, thank you so much, Derek. I really appreciate your spending this time with us this afternoon and early evening. And I hope everyone's so excited now to read his book if you haven't already done so. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today and hope that you will come to the council meeting tomorrow. And bless you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Allie.